The air smelled like damp earth, and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt trail echoed through the dense forest. The hike had started as a simple day trip, nothing too ambitious. Just a solo trek up to a ridge I'd read about online. A place with a great view, where you could see rolling hills stretch for miles, untouched by roads or buildings. I had packed light: a water bottle, some granola bars, a basic first aid kit, a small knife, and my phone. The sun was high when I started, golden light breaking through the trees, warming the cool morning air. I wasn't worried. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before. The trail started easy, wide, and well-trodden. I moved at a steady pace, letting my mind wander. The forest around me was thick, mostly pines and oaks, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Birds chirped somewhere above me. I took deep breaths, feeling the weight of my small backpack against my shoulders, feeling good. But then I made a mistake, a small one at first. Somewhere around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. There was a marker nailed to a tree, its paint faded and peeling. The arrow pointed left, but the trail to the right looked just as worn. I paused, checked my phone. No service. That wasn't surprising. I was deep in the woods, after all. I tried to remember the map I'd glanced at earlier. I was pretty sure the ridge was east, which meant left. But when I turned, something about the path didn't feel right. It was narrow, overgrown in spots. The other trail, the one leading right, looked clearer, more like a real path. I hesitated for another moment. Then I stepped right. I kept walking, confident at first. The trail was fine until it wasn't. The deeper I went, the fainter it became. Grass and bushes started closing in, the dirt path fading into something barely distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. I stopped, turned in a slow circle. The trees all looked the same. The sunlight had shifted, the golden glow turning harsh and sharp through the branches. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I sighed, annoyed at myself. Okay, no big deal. I could just turn around and go back the way I came. Except when I did, nothing looked familiar. I walked a few minutes, scanning the ground, looking for my own footprints. The soil was dry, covered in dead leaves and pine needles. If I had left tracks, they were gone now. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach. I shook it off. It was fine. I had a decent sense of direction. I'd retrace my steps, find the fork, and get back on the right path. But the more I walked, the more I realized I was wrong. I should have found the fork by now. The ground sloped downward where I was sure it hadn't before. The trees seemed denser. I stopped again, forcing myself to think. Had I passed this fallen log earlier? Was this clearing familiar? Every direction looked the same, an endless sprawl of green and brown. I checked my phone again, uselessly. No service. My breathing had changed. It was faster, shallower. I tried to slow it down, to stay calm. This wasn't a big deal. People got turned around in the woods all the time. I just had to keep moving. So I did. I walked for what felt like hours. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows that made everything look different. The heat of the afternoon pressed against me, sweat gathering under my backpack straps. My water bottle was half empty. At some point, I realized I wasn't on a trail at all anymore. I was just walking through the forest, pushing through thick undergrowth, stepping over roots and fallen branches. Panic started creeping in. Real panic, not just unease. I stopped, listened. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. The birds were gone, or maybe they were somewhere far off. The wind had died down. I suddenly felt exposed, standing there in the middle of nowhere, completely alone. I forced myself to think. What do I do? Stay put? Wait for someone to find me? No, that was stupid. No one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone my route. I had barely looked at the map before heading out. My best bet was to find a landmark, something recognizable. A ridge, a stream, anything. I kept walking, slower now, more deliberate. My body was sore, my legs aching from stepping over uneven ground. The forest felt different as the sun started to sink lower. The light took on a reddish hue, the trees casting long, twisting shadows. Then I heard something. first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was movement, something in the brush. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensing. It wasn't a deer. I'd seen plenty of deer before. They moved differently, fast, nervous. This was something heavier, slower. A bear? I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. Nothing. The sound had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe, no, there it was again. A rustling, a snap of a branch. Closer now. I gripped the small knife in my pocket, useless against anything bigger than a raccoon. I backed up, slow and careful. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I turned and walked faster. My pulse hammered in my ears. The forest seemed darker now. The shadows stretched wider. I kept moving, my breath coming quicker, every sound making my nerves jolt. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. I pushed forward, breaking into an uneven jog. My legs ached. My throat was dry. The last of the sunlight hit my face as I stumbled into the open space. And then I froze. A cabin, old, weathered, sitting in the middle of nowhere. The roof sagged in places, the walls covered in moss. It looked abandoned, but the door was open, not wide, just slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry. I stared at it, every instinct in me screaming to leave, but my body was exhausted. I needed water, rest, a chance to figure out what to do. I stepped closer, peering inside. Darkness, a faint smell, something damp, rotting wood, maybe something worse. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt leading up to the cabin. Fresh, someone had been here, recently. I turned away, my breath coming fast. No, this was wrong. I couldn't stay here. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, from inside the cabin, like weight shifting on old wooden floors. I didn't think. I ran, back into the trees, my legs burning, branches scratching my arms. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my body screamed for me to stop. But I didn't stop, not until I saw something through the trees, something man-made. A road. I stumbled toward it, collapsing onto the gravel. My hands scraped against the rough surface, my chest heaving. Then, in the distance, headlights. I don't remember much after that. The car slowed. A man got out. He asked if I was okay. I must have answered because next thing I knew, I was in the passenger seat, water pressed into my hands. I never told him about the cabin. I never looked back. I still don't know who or what was inside. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't know why I thought hiking alone was a good idea. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just needed to get away. Either way, it was a mistake. The plan was simple. A 2-day hike through a mountain trail I had read about online. It wasn't a famous spot, which made it more appealing. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. The guide I found said it was moderate difficulty, with clear paths, some rocky sections, and a few steep inclines. Nothing I couldn't handle. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a map, a compass, and my phone with a portable charger. I even brought a whistle and a small first aid kit just in case. I wasn't careless. I knew things could go wrong in the wild. The first day was perfect. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forests with towering trees. The air smelled fresh, clean, almost too pure compared to the city air I was used to. The only sounds were birds, the rustling of leaves, and my own footsteps. Every now and then, I'd stop to take in the view. The rolling hills, the deep valleys, the sky that stretched endlessly above me. By the time the sun started dipping, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a stream, soft ground, and plenty of dry wood for a fire. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat by the fire until the sky turned black. Felt good, peaceful. This was what I wanted: silence, solitude, escape. I slept well. No strange noises, no disturbances. When I woke up, the sun was already creeping through the trees. I packed up, filled my water bottle from the stream, and checked the map. The trail should loop around and lead me back to my starting point by midday. Easy. But something went wrong. Somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn. I didn't realize it at first. The path still looked like a trail, narrow but walked on. Maybe it was a side path that would reconnect with the main one. I kept walking and walking. After about an hour, I knew I had messed up. The trees were thicker now, the ground uneven. The path was fading, becoming more of a suggestion than a trail. My gut told me to turn back, but I didn't. I convinced myself that if I kept going, I'd find the main trail again. That was the biggest mistake of the day. The further I went, the worse it got. The ground sloped downward, steeper and steeper, until I was half sliding down loose dirt. The trees blocked the sun more than before, casting everything in a dull greenish-gray light. It was harder to tell which way I had come from. I stopped to check my phone. No service. Of course, I pulled out the map, but it wasn't helpful. I couldn't see any landmarks I recognized, just endless trees and hills. I tried using the compass, but I wasn't experienced enough to make sense of it. I took a deep breath. Panicking wouldn't help. I'd retrace my steps, go back the way I came. That was the smart thing to do. I turned around and started walking, but after 20 minutes, I wasn't sure if I was even going the right way anymore. The landscape all looked the same. Trees, rocks, dirt, shadows. I passed a fallen tree I was sure I hadn't seen before. Had I? Doubt crept in. My mind started playing tricks on me. Had I really come from this direction? Or was I just wandering deeper? I pushed forward. Another hour passed. My legs were aching. I finished the last of my water. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, just my own breathing. I needed a new plan. I had read once that if you get lost, the best thing to do is stay put. Let rescue teams find you instead of wandering aimlessly. That made sense. I found a relatively flat spot and sat down. I still had food. I could wait. Someone would come looking for me eventually. But then I started thinking. No one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone my exact route, just that I was hiking in the mountains. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. If I stayed put, no one would find me. I stood up and kept moving. Hours passed. My stomach was empty, my throat dry. My legs felt like lead. The terrain was rough. Steep slopes, loose rocks, tangled roots. The sun was getting lower. I needed to find water. That was the priority now. Then I heard it, a faint trickling sound. Water. I moved toward it, half stumbling down a rocky incline. And there it was, a small stream, shallow but moving. Relief washed over me. I dropped to my knees and drank. It was cold, fresh, the best water I'd ever tasted. With my thirst quenched, I started thinking clearly again. Water meant life. If I followed the stream, it might lead to a river, and rivers often lead to civilization. It was my best shot. I walked alongside it, my hope returning. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a new problem arose. Darkness. I needed shelter. I found a rock overhang and settled beneath it. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep me covered. I ate a granola bar and forced myself to rest. Every sound made me jump. A rustling in the bushes, the snap of a branch. My mind conjured images of mountain lions, bears, things watching me from the darkness. I barely slept. Morning came and I started moving again, following the stream. My legs were sore, my stomach empty, but I kept going. Hours passed. The stream widened. That was a good sign. Then I saw footprints. Not mine. Someone had been here. Hope surged through me. I followed them, moving faster now. The trees thinned, and suddenly, the landscape opened up. A dirt road. I almost cried. I followed the road, my body running on pure adrenaline. After what felt like forever, I saw a cabin in the distance. Smoke from a chimney. Civilization. A man came outside as I approached, eyes widening when he saw me. I must have looked awful, dirty, exhausted, dehydrated. He asked if I was okay, but I barely heard him. I was safe. Took days to recover. My body was weak, my mind exhausted, but I was alive. I don't think I'll ever hike alone again. I don't know why I chose that trail. I had hiked alone before plenty of times. There was something about being alone in the woods that felt right. No distractions, no noise, just my own footsteps, my breath, and the quiet rhythm of nature. This time, I picked a trail I hadn't done before. It wasn't too far from where I lived, maybe an hour's drive out of town. The online descriptions said it was remote, not a lot of traffic, but nothing extreme. Just a long stretch through dense forest, leading up to a ridge with a great view. A solid, peaceful hike. I packed light. Enough water for the day, a couple of energy bars, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and my phone. No cell service out there, but that didn't bother me. I had a compass and a printed map in case I needed them. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well worn, winding through tall pines and thick undergrowth. The morning air was crisp, the scent of damp earth filling my lungs. Birds chirped somewhere in the trees. Felt good, peaceful. But then I made a mistake. It was a small thing, really, the kind of decision that doesn't seem like much at the time. Somewhere around midday, I came to a fork in the trail. The official path veered left, but there was another trail to the right, narrower, a little overgrown, but still a clear path. It looked like an old service road or maybe a shortcut. I stopped, checked my map. The main trail looped around the ridge in a long curve, but this smaller path seemed to cut straight through. If it led where I thought it did, I could save time and get to the ridge faster. Felt like the right move. I took the path. First, it was fine. The ground was firm, the trees pressing in a little closer, but nothing unusual. I moved quickly, keeping my pace steady. But after a while, I noticed the trail getting rougher. More rocks, more roots. The dirt was looser, the slope steeper than I expected. I figured I'd just follow it to the ridge, then reconnect with the main trail. No big deal. But then the trail started to disappear. It wasn't immediate. It just got fainter, narrower. The further I went, the more it felt like no one had walked it in a long time. Bushes and ferns started closing in, the path barely visible under dead leaves and tangled roots. I slowed down. The smart thing would have been to turn back, but I didn't. I told myself the ridge had to be close. I could see glimpses of sky through the trees, the light shifting as the forest thinned out. I just needed to push a little further. Then I stepped wrong. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I don't know. I stumbled forward, tried to catch myself, but the ground wasn't solid. It gave out beneath me. I didn't even have time to react. 1 second I was upright, the next I was sliding, tumbling, dirt and leaves and branches tearing at my arms and legs. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my side as I came to a stop. I gasped, blinking up at the sky. My ears rang. My hands stung where they'd scraped against the rocks. I tried to sit up, wincing. My ankle throbbed, but nothing felt broken. I took a slow, shaky breath. Then I looked around. I had fallen into some kind of ravine. The ground sloped up steeply on all sides, the walls thick with tangled roots and loose dirt. The trail was gone. I stood carefully, testing my weight. My ankle hurt, but I could walk. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. No signs of the trail. No signs of anything. I was deep in the woods now. I reached for my phone. No service, of course. The battery was still good, though, so I turned on the flashlight and checked my surroundings. The ravine stretched out in both directions, a dry creek bed running through the middle. If I followed it long enough, it would probably lead to a larger stream. Streams usually led to rivers, and rivers led to people. It was a plan. I started walking. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees grew taller here, their branches thick overhead, blocking most of the light. The air was damp, cooler. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled my nose. Then I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, pressed into the soft mud near the creek bed. Too fresh to be old. Someone else had been here recently, but no one was supposed to be out here. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Then I kept walking. The footprints led in the same direction I was going. They weren't heavy, not deep like someone running or carrying something. Just slow, steady steps. After about 20 minutes, I saw something up ahead. A structure. Not a house, not a cabin, just something. I approached slowly. It was an old wooden frame, half collapsed, like someone had tried to build a shelter and given up. Beside it, a pile of bones. Animal, I told myself. Had to be. But I didn't get closer to check. Something about this place felt wrong. The footprints kept going, past the structure, deeper into the ravine. I wasn't sure if I wanted to follow them anymore, but I didn't have much choice. I kept moving. The forest pressed in closer. The trees felt different now, older, twisted. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp rot. Every sound seemed louder. The rustling leaves, the snap of a twig, my own breathing. Then I heard something else. A low, distant sound. A shuffle. A scrape. I stopped. Listened. Silence. I told myself it was just the woods settling. Just my nerves. I moved faster. The creek bed curved, and as I rounded the bend, I saw something that made my blood go cold. A backpack. It was half buried in the dirt, torn open like something had clawed through it. Next to it, a shoe. A single, mud-stained hiking boot. I swallowed hard. Someone else had been lost out here, and they hadn't made it out. I turned, my heart hammering, and started back the way I came. I didn't care about finding the trail anymore. I didn't care about the ridge. I just wanted out. I walked as fast as I could without running. My ankle ached. My breath came in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. The trees felt like they were closing in. The air was too thick, the silence too deep. Then I saw it. Another footprint. Fresh. Right next to mine. Someone was following me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I pushed forward, forcing myself to stay calm. My only goal now was to get out of the ravine, find higher ground, and keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees. Light. The slope ahead was steep, but I scrambled up, clawing at the dirt, pulling myself up with roots and rocks. My hands were shaking, my legs burning. Then solid ground. I was back in the forest. I turned, looking down into the ravine one last time. There was nothing there, just shadows and trees. But I knew I wasn't alone down there. I never was. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I was miles away. I don't hike alone anymore. I've always liked hiking alone. Some people say it's reckless. Some call it dangerous. But for me, there's nothing better than being miles away from everything. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the feel of the pack on my shoulders, the rhythm of my own breathing as I move through the wild. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. A week-long solo hike through a remote stretch of wilderness, deep in the mountains, far from any marked trails. I had planned it carefully, studied my maps, packed everything I'd need. I wasn't worried. I should have been. I parked at the trailhead, 3 hours from the nearest town. There were no other cars, just mine, alone in the gravel lot. It was early morning, the air still cool. I locked my truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking. For the first few miles, the trail was easy. Well-worn dirt, lined with pine trees, sunlight filtering through the branches. I made good time, enjoying the solitude. Around midday, I reached the spot where I planned to leave the marked path. My route would take me deep into the backcountry, following old game trails and navigating by map and compass. I took a deep breath, checked my bearings, and stepped off the trail. The trees swallowed me whole. The first night passed without trouble. I set up camp in a small clearing, cooked a quick meal, and lay in my tent, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. By morning, I felt refreshed. I packed up, checked my map, and kept moving. As I hiked, the terrain grew rougher. The undergrowth was thick, the trees closer together. I had to push my way through tangled branches, step carefully over uneven ground. That's when I saw it. A tree with deep, deliberate cuts in the bark. 3 long slashes, perfectly parallel. I stopped, frowning. The cuts were old, the edges darkened with time. Maybe an old trail marker? A hunter's sign? I wasn't sure. I kept walking. A few hours later, I found another tree. Same 3 marks. I told myself it didn't mean anything, probably just a coincidence. That night, as I lay in my tent, I thought I heard something moving outside. A slow, steady rustling. Not the wind, something else. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I kept my knife close. I woke up uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I packed up camp quickly and kept moving, determined to get back on track. The further I walked, the more the land changed. The trees seemed taller here, their trunks massive and ancient. The undergrowth was thicker, making every step a struggle. I checked my compass often, making sure I was heading the right way. But something wasn't right. The terrain didn't match my map. I should have been near a ridgeline by now. Instead, the land sloped downward into a deep valley. I double-checked my bearings. I was going the right way, so why wasn't the landscape matching? I kept walking, hoping to regain my sense of direction. Then I saw the 3rd marked tree. Same 3 cuts. My stomach twisted. I had been walking for hours. How could I have looped back to the same spot? I pulled out my map, scanning it, trying to make sense of things. Then I realized something else. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. A heavy, unnatural silence. Something was wrong. I forced myself to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made my skin crawl. At first light, I packed up and started walking, determined to get back on track. Then, late in the afternoon, I found the campsite. It wasn't mine. A single tent, collapsed and torn. A rusted stove. A backpack half buried in the dirt. I stepped closer, my breath tight in my chest. The gear was old, covered in moss and grime. It had been here for years. I knelt down, unzipped the backpack. Inside was a faded notebook. I flipped through the pages, the paper brittle beneath my fingers. Most of the writing was smeared, unreadable, but one line stood out. Don't follow the marks. My stomach dropped. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. The marks, the 3 cuts in the bark. Someone else had seen them, and they had left this warning. I turned and walked away quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I woke up exhausted. My food was running low, my water nearly gone. I needed to get out. I checked my map, my compass, trying to find the fastest route back. But the land still didn't match what it should have been. Then I saw something ahead. A structure. Not a cabin. Not a shelter. Just a wooden frame like the skeleton of an old outpost. The wood was dark with age, half covered in moss. I stepped closer. Inside, there was nothing. Just a pile of leaves and dirt. But on one of the beams, someone had carved something deep into the wood. Turn around. My skin crawled. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Something crunched behind me. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until my vision blurred, until the trees thinned and I saw something ahead. A road. I stumbled onto the pavement, barely believing it was real. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. Car slowed. A driver stared at me in confusion. I didn't care. I was out. I never found out who left that notebook. I never reported the abandoned campsite. I never told anyone about the marks in the trees, because some things in the wild are better left alone. And I was never going back. There's something about being in the middle of nowhere that makes you feel completely free. No phone, no noise, no other people, just you and the wild. That's what I loved about hiking alone. No distractions, no responsibilities, just surviving off what I carried on my back and the choices I made. That's what I told myself when I planned this trip. A week-long solo hike through a remote section of forest I had never explored before. The route was supposed to be tough but doable, a mix of marked trails and backcountry navigation. I had done plenty of hikes like this before, and I was confident in my skills. The plan was simple. Start at a small trailhead about 3 hours from the nearest town, follow a loop through deep wilderness, and come back out where I started. I had my gear, a detailed map, and enough food to last. I wasn't worried. I should have been. The first day was perfect. I started early, the morning air cool and crisp. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through thick pine forests and crossing a few small streams. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. By late afternoon, I had covered nearly 12 miles. I found a good campsite near a quiet river, set up my tent, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, I sat by the water, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I wanted. The night passed without incident. I slept well, waking only once when I heard something moving through the brush nearby. Probably a deer. Nothing to worry about. The second day, I pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain became rougher, the trail steeper. I checked my map often, making sure I was on track. Around midday, I reached a fork in the path. My map showed the main trail continuing left, but there was also an unmarked trail leading right. It wasn't on my map, but it looked well-traveled. I hesitated. Taking unknown paths wasn't smart, but it seemed like it might be a shortcut, and I liked the idea of making better time. I turned right. First, everything seemed fine. The trail was rougher, narrower, but still visible. I figured it must be an older route, maybe an old logging road or a game trail. Then, after about an hour, it started to fade. The dirt path became patches of trampled grass. Then nothing at all. I stopped, looked around. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth tangled. I checked my map, trying to match the landscape to anything marked. Nothing. I turned back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. After another hour, I knew I was lost. I woke up sore and exhausted. I had set up camp in a small clearing the night before, hoping morning light would help me find my way. Didn't. I checked my compass. If I kept heading west, I should eventually hit a stream that ran near the main trail. I started walking. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch. Then I saw it. A boot, old, half buried in the dirt. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed. Someone had been here before. I looked around, but there was no sign of a trail, just endless trees. I kept moving. Hours passed. The sun started sinking. My stomach growled, but I didn't want to stop. I needed to find a way out. Then I saw something else. A structure. Not a cabin. Not a shelter. Just a wooden frame like the skeleton of an old outpost. The wood was dark with age, half covered in moss. I stepped closer. Inside, there was nothing, just a pile of leaves and dirt. But on one of the beams, someone had carved something deep into the wood. Turn around. My skin crawled. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds. I walked away quickly. The next day, I moved fast. My food was running low, and my water was nearly gone. I needed to find that stream. The terrain became steeper, the ground rocky and uneven. My ankle twisted on a loose stone, sending a sharp pain up my leg. I gritted my teeth and kept going. Then I found the second boot, a few feet away from the first. Same age, same condition. But this time, there was something else nearby. A backpack. It was torn, the straps frayed, the fabric stained with dirt. I knelt down, unzipped it. Inside was an old map, a rusted knife, a few empty food wrappers, and a notebook. I flipped through the pages. Most of it was unreadable, the ink smeared, the paper brittle. But on the last page, I could make out 5 words. Don't go into the valley. I looked up. The land sloped downward ahead of me, leading into a deep ravine. A valley. A part of me wanted to listen to the warning, to turn around, find another way. But I was running out of options. I descended into the valley. The trees grew taller here, their trunks thick and ancient. The air was still heavy. I followed the land downward, my legs burning. Every so often, I glanced back, feeling watched. Then I found the camp. Not mine, someone else's. The tent was collapsed, torn open like something had ripped through it. A fire pit sat cold and untouched, and scattered around the site were more notebooks. I picked one up. The pages were damp, falling apart. But one line stood out. "I hear them at night." I dropped the notebook and backed away. Something crunched behind me. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until the trees thinned, until I saw something ahead. A road. I stumbled onto the pavement, barely believing it was real. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. The car slowed, the driver staring at me in confusion. I didn't care. I was out. I never found out who left those notebooks, or what happened to the person who owned that backpack. I never reported the campsite or the boots, because some things in the wild are better left alone, and I was never going back. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that changes the way you think. First, it's peaceful. The quiet settles over you, and you start to notice things. The way the wind moves through the trees, the distant sound of a bird calling out. Feels good, like stepping away from the noise of the world and into something older, something real. But then, after a while, that peace shifts into something else. The quiet stops feeling comforting. It starts to press down on you, filling up all the empty spaces in your mind. You realize how alone you are, how far away from help. That's when the fear sets in. I didn't feel afraid when I started my hike. I had done plenty of solo trips before, and I considered myself prepared. I packed everything I needed: food, water, a tent, extra layers in case the weather turned. I had a map and a compass, even though I had the route memorized. I didn't take chances when it came to the wilderness. The trail I picked was deep in the mountains, away from the usual weekend hikers. It wasn't a completely unmarked path, but it wasn't well maintained either. I liked it that way. The fewer people, the better. I planned for a 4-day loop, starting at a small parking area and circling around a valley before climbing up a ridgeline and back down to my car. I expected rough terrain. Steep inclines, narrow switchbacks, sections where the path would be little more than packed dirt winding between thick trees. I looked forward to it. The first day went exactly as planned. I started early in the morning, the air crisp and cool. The trail was quiet, the only sounds coming from my boots crunching over fallen leaves and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I moved quickly, covering over 10 miles by mid-afternoon. I found a good spot to camp near a small stream, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed if anyone else happened to come through. I set up my tent, cooked a simple meal, and sat back against a tree, enjoying the solitude. The night was uneventful. I slept well, waking only once to the sound of an animal moving somewhere in the distance, probably a deer. I packed up and started early again. The terrain grew steeper, the path winding up the side of a ridge. The air was thinner here, the trees sparser. By midday, I reached a viewpoint overlooking the valley below. The mountains stretched out in every direction, endless green rolling toward the horizon. It was beautiful, the kind of view that reminded me why I did this. I checked my map, confirming the next leg of the trail. From here, the path would drop down into a thickly wooded area before climbing back up the other side of the valley. I estimated I had another 6 or 7 miles to go before I'd make camp for the night. I started my descent, the ground uneven beneath my boots. The trees closed in around me, blocking out the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, damp with the scent of moss and earth. It was about an hour later that I saw the first sign something was wrong. The trail, which had been clear up until now, suddenly looked different, less defined, almost like it had been washed out at some point, the edges crumbling into the undergrowth. I hesitated, pulling out my map again. I was certain I was in the right place. The valley was exactly where it should be. The ridgeline behind me matched up with the topography. I kept moving, but the further I went, the worse it got. The trail wasn't just overgrown, it was disappearing. By the time I realized I had made a mistake, it was too late. The path was gone. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the patches of ferns growing along the ground. It all blended together. I couldn't find the trail. I wasn't panicked yet. I had my compass, and I knew the general direction I needed to go. I could backtrack until I found my way. I walked for an hour, then 2. Nothing. The sun dipped lower, the light filtering through the trees turning golden. I knew I needed to stop soon. Hiking in the dark would only make things worse. I found a flat stretch of ground and set up my tent. I ate a small meal, forcing myself to stay calm. Tomorrow I'd correct my mistake. That night I barely slept. Morning came, gray and cold. I packed up quickly, determined to find my way back to the trail. I used my compass, moving in the direction I knew the path should be. But the terrain fought against me. Thick undergrowth slowed my progress. Fallen trees forced me to detour. And the deeper I went, the more I realized something unsettling. This part of the forest didn't feel right. There were no signs of animals. No birds, no insects buzzing in the air. Just silence. Then I found something worse. A campsite, or what was left of one. A single tent, collapsed and torn open. The fabric was faded. The poles snapped. Nearby, a backpack lay half buried in leaves. I moved closer, my stomach twisting. The pack was old, the material rotting. I knelt down and pulled at the zipper, my hands unsteady. Inside, I found a few scattered belongings. A rusted knife, a flashlight with dead batteries, a map so faded I couldn't read it. No food, no water, and no sign of the person who left it here. A cold dread settled in my chest. This wasn't recent. The tent, the bag, it had been here for years. I stood up, scanning the trees. My skin crawled. I wasn't the first person to get lost here. I left the campsite behind, moving faster now. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just wanted out. Then, as the light started to fade, I saw something through the trees. A structure. At first, I thought it was another tent, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small wooden shack. The roof sagged, the walls covered in moss. I should have kept moving, but I didn't. I stepped closer, peering through the open doorway. Inside, there was nothing, just an empty room, a few broken wooden crates stacked in the corner, and a message carved into the wall. Don't stay after dark. I backed away, my breath coming fast. I turned and started walking, then jogging, then running. I didn't stop until I couldn't breathe. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, gripping my knife, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, I kept moving. My legs ached, my throat was dry, but I didn't care. I walked until the trees thinned, until I saw something that nearly brought me to my knees. A road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, barely believing it was real. And then, in the distance, I saw a car. I waved my arms, my heart pounding as it slowed. The driver rolled down his window, his face a mask of confusion. I must have looked wild, dirty, exhausted, my clothes torn. I didn't care. I was out. I never found that trail again, and I never went back. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike deep into the mountains, miles away from any town or road. I wanted to disconnect, to feel the raw quiet of nature. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots crunching on dirt. I picked a trail that wasn't well known, something challenging but not impossible. A loop about 30 miles long, winding through dense forests and rocky ridges. The weather looked good, cool and dry, perfect for a few nights alone in the wilderness. I packed my gear, tent, food, water, a map, and a compass. I felt prepared. The first day was perfect. I started early, the morning air crisp, the sun breaking through the trees in golden streaks. The trail was narrow but well-marked. Birds called from the branches, and every so often, I'd spot a deer or a rabbit darting through the undergrowth. I moved fast, covering nearly 15 miles by sunset. I found a flat spot near a small stream and set up my tent. The night was peaceful. I ate a quick meal, listened to the sounds of the forest, and fell asleep, feeling completely at ease. The next morning, I broke camp early. I checked my map, made sure I was still on track, and started hiking again. The trail became steeper, winding up through rocky terrain. The trees thinned out, giving way to views of distant peaks. I felt strong, confident. Around noon, I reached a fork in the trail. I checked my map. The main path curved left, but a smaller, unmarked trail cut to the right. It looked well-trodden, not just an animal path. Maybe it was a shortcut? I hesitated. My map didn't show this trail, but I figured it might link back up with the main loop. If it saved me a few miles, why not? I turned right. At first, it was fine. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through thick trees. I kept a steady pace, but after an hour, something felt off. The path was fading, becoming less distinct. Branches blocked parts of it, like no one had used it in years. I checked my map again. Still no sign of this trail. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I kept going, thinking I'd reconnect with the main trail soon. Then the path vanished completely. Lost. I stopped, looked around. There was no clear way forward, no sign of where the trail had been. I turned back the way I came, but after a few minutes, I realized I wasn't sure if I was retracing my steps. The forest looked different. Everything looked the same. I pulled out my compass. North. I knew which direction the main trail should be, so I started walking that way. An hour passed, then another. The forest thickened. The ground became uneven, and the sun started dipping lower. My heart pounded. I wasn't just off trail. I was lost. I forced myself to stay calm. I had supplies. I wasn't injured. I could get through this. I picked a spot to camp, hoping daylight would make things clearer in the morning. I ate a small meal, conserving my food. The night was silent, except for the wind moving through the trees. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing. The next morning, I tried again. I moved slow, checking my compass every few minutes. But the terrain became worse, steeper, rockier. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their roots snaking over the ground like veins. Then I slipped. My foot caught on something, and I tumbled down a short slope, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through my leg. I gritted my teeth and sat up, testing it. Nothing broken, but my ankle throbbed. I took deep breaths, trying to steady myself. I had to keep going. By midday, I was exhausted. My water supply was running low. I needed to find a stream, but I hadn't seen one since yesterday. Then, in the distance, I heard something, water. I limped toward the sound. After a few minutes, I found a small creek trickling through the rocks. Relief washed over me. I filled my bottle, drank deeply, and let myself rest for a moment. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the water, half buried in the dirt, was a shoe. It was old, the fabric torn, the sole peeling away. But it was definitely a hiking boot. Someone had been here before. I looked around, scanning the area. No sign of a campsite, no gear, no footprints. Just the shoe, abandoned like its owner had walked away without it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I pushed forward, moving downstream. If I followed the water, maybe it would lead me to a larger river or a road. But as I walked, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Tracks. Not animal tracks. Human footprints, deep in the mud. Barefoot. They weren't mine. The prints looked fresh, the edges still sharp. They led away from the creek, vanishing into the trees. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they went. I kept moving, forcing myself to ignore the way my skin crawled. The cabin. By late afternoon, my energy was gone. My ankle throbbed. My stomach ached with hunger. Then, through the trees, I saw something unnatural. A structure. A small cabin half hidden in the woods. The wood was old, dark with rot. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay away, but I needed shelter. I limped to the door. It was slightly open. Inside, dust coated every surface. A single chair sat in the middle of the room. A wooden table, empty shelves. Then I saw the backpack. It was shoved into the corner, covered in dirt. I stepped closer and knelt down, brushing it off. The zipper was broken, but I pried it open. Inside, I found a map, a torn sleeping bag, a rusted knife, and a notebook. The pages were weathered, the ink faded. I flipped through it, my heart pounding. Scrawled handwriting covered the last page. 3 words repeated over and over. I heard a sound outside, a branch snapping. I froze. For a long moment, I didn't move. didn't breathe. Then, slowly, I reached for my pack and slipped out the door. I didn't look back. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I pushed through. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get as far from that cabin as possible. As the sun set, I heard rushing water ahead, a river, wide and fast-moving. On the other side, I saw something, an old, weathered sign. A road. I forced myself into the water, crossing as quickly as I could. The current pulled at me, soaking my clothes, but I made it across. I stumbled up the bank and onto the road. And then, finally, in the distance, headlights appeared. I waved my arms, screaming for help. The car stopped. A man got out, staring at me in shock. I must have looked insane. Soaked, limping, covered in dirt. I didn't care. I was safe. I never found out who left that notebook, or whose footprints I saw. But I know one thing, something was out there in those woods, and I was never going back.